Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your dose of Star Wars podcast joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. I feel like I'm putting the word joy in air quotes, like when Palpatine talks about Chancellor Valorum and his baseless accusations of corruption. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily feel so joyful. We're talking about 2024, and the biggest story of 2024 is The Acolyte, and The Acolyte is really the future of Star Wars writ large for us now. The Acolyte, of course, was the 8-episode limited series that debuted on Disney Plus in June of this year. It wasn't exactly critically acclaimed, but it wasn't panned either. According to Rotten Tomatoes, the top critic score is 72%. So, I mean, it's positive to be sure. But of course, the series was brigaded by certain corners of the internet, and the audience score says it's at 19%. You know what the deal is with that. We've been experiencing it for the past decade since Star Wars was purchased by Disney. And I wish we didn't have to consider stuff like that, but unfortunately we do, because of course media, particularly mainstream media and also fandom media, has bitten hard on this over and over again. And there are at least anecdotal reports that viewership could have been depressed because of the negative publicity that The Acolyte garnered. On the positive side, it already had a built-in fan base. So you're familiar with what used to be called Project Luminous when it was under wraps, or what became the High Republic multi-ginormous mega media publishing initiative, right? Books and audiobooks and comics and manga, and eventually building up to the release of the Acolyte TV series. They had multiple phases over multiple years. They were able to build up an audience for this particular period of time within Star Wars storytelling, and it really was leading to this culminating moment with the series. And while initially it looked like the ratings might be okay, it turns out that they weren't that good, unfortunately. They were among the lowest of any Star Wars series so far. That being said, competition is kind of an issue, of course, and also the reporting is a little hard to get, because the way that various streaming rating services have been reporting on things, they've been adding in non-scripted reality style shows into the mix, and those of course are very popular and knock stuff down. But we were looking at Real Good Ratings and Luminate and Nielsen and a couple of others, and it looked like The Acolyte was percolating in the top 10s of some of these services and not others. And in true Jedi business fashion, those are the episodes that we do on the show here where we talk about ratings and performance and that sort of thing. I did try to parse it in terms of the number of minutes, because compared to, say, the Ahsoka series, the Acolyte had about 50 minutes less runtime than the Ahsoka series. And so when you see the number of minutes viewed, well, you know, it's already going to be less because the episodes are shorter. And so what does that really mean? But even when you do a little bit of math to try to estimate the number of people who are watching the show, it still unfortunately doesn't wash. So you could point to those results and say that's the reason why Disney decided to cancel the potential for a season 2 of The Acolyte, but that wouldn't be the entire story, because the way that the streaming industry has evolved over the past 5 years, we're at the point where the number one statistic that everybody is looking for and that Wall Street is looking for is not viewer time, it's subscribers. And so if a show is not contributing to the addition of subscribers to the base, then it is not nearly as valuable for that particular streaming service. Earlier this year, there was, one of the Disney Investor Day presentations, and Bob Iger was talking particularly about Inside Out 2 and it being added to the platform. And the number one thing that he highlighted about its addition for the investors was that it came with an addition of 1.5 million subscribers to Disney Plus. Meanwhile, I did a very unscientific survey earlier this year of folks on social media asking one particular question, which is, if you have signed up for Disney Plus because you're a Star Wars fan, do you keep it all the time, or do you subscribe on and off and on and off? And more than 80% of the people who responded to the survey said that they are just always on with their Disney Plus subscription because they want access to their Star Wars content all the time. And the rest of those folks are churning. So what's happening is that new Star Wars live action content on Disney Plus does not seem to be adding significantly to the subscriber base. Certainly having Star Wars fans subscribe at launch with the addition of the entire movie catalog and with the start of The Mandalorian, right? Like that definitely got everybody from Star Wars on board. But now Disney Plus is at a point where it is really hard to add a subscriber because of a new live action Star Wars show. When you see reports about how much it costs to produce a Star Wars show, and there was a lot of discourse around how much the Acolyte cost, you'll see things that talk about how much it costs per minute of television that appears on screen. And while certainly it's interesting to see that from a trend perspective, it's not really the amount that matters. The amount that matters is the amount that it costs compared to the number of subscribers Disney Plus gains for the production of that show, and also how long those subscribers stick around. If they're just churning within 3 months afterward, then it doesn't really do much for Disney Plus at all. And so, yeah, the amount of money it cost compared to minutes watched is kind of a vanity metric comparatively. It really matters to the shareholders and to the green lighting of new productions, how many subscribers are being generated by the content that they're producing. This isn't only a Star Wars problem though. This is really a problem with the streaming industry as a whole, right? Like as streaming services increase the size of their catalogs, then everything that they add to it has incrementally less value. And so it's tougher to justify the expenditure, especially if you're a younger service and you're trying to catch up to Netflix and compete with them, right? So you don't have a lot of choices in that regard. Like you can overspend on content like crazy to create some sort of, Big Bang like situation and get your subscriber numbers really rolling, but that's only good for a certain period of time. Once things sort of taper off, once the subscriber growth plateaus, then you only have a couple of options, and those are basically to either make less content or find ways to make content more cheaply. In the case of Disney Plus, well, they've been telling us for a couple of years now that the plan is to produce less content, that they did what they did because they had to get the platform off the ground. Now that it is off the ground, they are right-sizing the content production, which means that we are going to see less brand new content coming, which means specifically that we're going to see less brand new Star Wars content coming. So whereas we had a glorious run of 2 or even 3 Star Wars live action TV series debuting in a given year, we're at the point where it's going to be 1, and that's about it. And maybe we'll get an animated series as well. That would be wonderful. Certainly those cost less to produce, and so that would fall into the other option that streaming services have. You can see the trend unfolding already. Right now, the only series that is coming out in 2025 live action series from Star Wars is season 2 of Andor. That drops beginning in April of 2025. The next series that we have any idea of being on the docket is season 2 of Ahsoka, and supposedly that's not going to start filming until midway through 2025, which means we are definitely not going to see it until 2026 at the earliest. So that's the produce less content side of things. And then for the produce cheaper content side of things, well, they've already announced that Star Wars Visions is going to get a volume 3 that we'll see in 2025. And that costs less to produce than a live action series, which means then we're going to start seeing a redirection of energy back to Star Wars in movie theaters. So of course, the Mandalorian and Grogu movie is slated for May of 2026. Filming is still happening right now, so they will be in post-production through the majority of 2025. We don't know what's happening with the Rey New Jedi Order movie. It's off the calendar right now, or at least the December of 2026 movie is off the calendar, and everybody presumed that that was going to be the one we haven't heard anything about it recently, so yeah, one wonders what's going on with that, of course, and the fine folks at Disney and Lucasfilm do not really like to share a lot of information about that, and considering what people do with it in fandom publicity and certain corners, like, you can hardly blame them. But for these last couple of years of Bob Iger's second tenure as CEO of Disney, we're going to see how a strategy plays out where they go with less content and cheaper content, and see whether they are still able to grow their subscriber base as a result. And it isn't just Star Wars that they have to be able to contribute to that. Luckily for them, they have a lot of other irons in the fire. So yeah, it remains to be seen whether this is going to be a strategy that works, or if it's going to be a strategy that ends up getting Disney acquired by someone, or businesses spun off, or some fun stuff like that. Ultimately, you and I, as Star Wars fans, we suffer a little bit as a result of all of this, and the creators of the Acolyte suffer as a result of this too. You know, it wasn't a perfect series, and that's perfectly fine. Not every series is a perfect series, and honestly, it was good enough to get a season 2. It really was, and could have done some very interesting and fascinating things that I think really would have entertained Star Wars fans in his season 2. Instead, it seems like it's going to continue on in the media that the High Republic initially launched in books and comics and so forth. There was a lot of Acolyte tied-in stuff that was announced at various Comic-Cons in 2024, and it reminds me of what George Lucas's plans were for sequels to Star Wars, right? Like Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the novel by Alan Dean Foster, that was the very first novel in the expanded universe. That was basically the plan for a low-budget sequel to Star Wars if the original, aka A New Hope, did not perform well at the box office. So yeah, publishing has long been the home for wonderful ideas that, you know, if they weren't able to get a foothold in the popular live action audience, then certainly they were able to live on in other ways and accrue dedicated fans. So that is my summary of the biggest Star Wars story of 2024, the story of the Acolyte, which is as much a story about Star Wars storytelling that we will be looking forward to over the next 10 years, as it is a story about the streaming industry in general. And that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode, as always, and may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.